I have a feeling, and I could be wrong, but I have a feeling that of all the videos I've done so far, this is going to be the one that gets the most comments. I could be wrong, but PSR is a controversial subject. It's I was hesitant to even cover it. It's a little bit like talking about politics or pro-life or pro-choice. I mean, it's not as serious as those things unless you are in the railroad community, and it's very serious. I haven't really heard a lot of railroaders say anything nice, so I'm very curious to get, especially the railroaders' comments on this video. Now, if you ask a Wall Street person about precision scheduled railroading, PSR, they'll tell you it transformed the railroad industry. It made railroads leaner. It made railroads more efficient. It made railroads enormously profitable. Ask a lot of railroaders about PSR, and you are going to get a very different answer. Longer trains, fewer employees, closed yards, locomotives parked or scrapped, and a railroad expected to move more freight with fewer resources available to it. So, how can something that's been so successful for the railroad companies be so hated by many of the people who actually run the trains? Well, today we're going to talk about that. My name is Mark Magana, and this is Railroad Economics, where we talk about the business behind the trains. And today, we are going to find out why railroaders hate PSR. Now, as I alluded to earlier, PSR stands for Precision Scheduled Railroading. If you don't already know, that's okay. We have lots of people from all different walks of life at this channel. It's one thing I love about it. Now, despite the name, it doesn't simply mean running freight trains according to a very precise schedule. The philosophy is most closely associated with railroad executive E. Hunter Harrison, who began developing and operating this approach at the Illinois Central in the 1990s, and later on he brought it to Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, and eventually CSX. At its core, Harrison believed railroads had become too complicated. They were too asset heavy and too willing to just accept inefficiency as part of the cost of doing business. Traditionally, freight railroading often involved holding cars in the yard, just keeping them there, until enough of them accumulated to justify moving a train. Cars might sit in the rail yard for a good long while until enough traffic was available. Trains were assembled, moved to another yard, broken apart, classified again, and eventually sent toward their destinations. Every one of those steps costs money. It requires track, it requires locomotives, it requires employees, and perhaps most importantly, it requires time. PSR changes the emphasis. Instead of optimizing the railroad around individual trains and yards, the goal is to keep individual freight cars moving through the network according to a plan, with as little unnecessary handling and waiting as possible. That can mean running trains on a more disciplined schedule, bypassing classification yards when possible, combining traffic that might previously have moved on using separate trains, and finding more direct ways to move a car from its origin to its destination. The idea is pretty simple. A freight car sitting still isn't making anyone any money. Harrison's philosophy emphasized reducing dwell time, minimizing unnecessary switching, using locomotives and rail cars more efficiently, simplifying operations, and maintaining a more disciplined operating plan. None of that, and hopefully you're still with me because I know that was very boring operational jargon, but none of that sounds particularly outrageous, right? That all sounds like a good, efficient way to run a company. In fact, quite a bit of it just sounds like common sense. And Harrison, he had results to point to. At Illinois Central, the railroad's operating ratio fell from roughly 98% to around 65% within several years. If you're not familiar with operating ratio, I talked about it in a video about 2 weeks ago where I went over the quarterly results for the railroads. Basically, it's how much of the railroad's income gets used up running the railroad. It's their cost of doing business, basically. The lower that number, the better. So going from 98 to 65, that's huge. Other railroad executives and Wall Street, they absolutely noticed. Now, one supposed benefit of PSR is something railfans point to and seem to appreciate: foreign power. That's when you see, for example, a big yellow Union Pacific locomotive running hundreds of miles away from its home tracks on maybe the Norfolk Southern or CSX line. And that is something railfans now see pretty regularly. It is kind of cool to see foreign power, I got to admit that. I only saw one railroad for the most part growing up. Everything was Santa Fe. At least that was a cool railroad to look at because of those bonnets back then, but I digress. A lot of railfans, they like to credit PSR with being the reason we see so much foreign power. The truth is, and I'm sorry guys, that's not actually accurate. Railroads were using run-through locomotives and pooling power long before precision scheduled railroading existed. Changing locomotives every time a train moves from one railroad to another takes time and ties up equipment. What PSR did do was place even greater emphasis on getting as much use as possible out of every locomotive. So the two ideas, they do fit together. But foreign power is not a direct result of PSR. If a perfectly good locomotive is already attached to a train, why waste time replacing it just because the name painted on the side doesn't match the railroad it's currently running on? So what if it says Union Pacific? So what if it says BNSF? PSR didn't invent foreign power. And we'll get into why you see other railroads' locomotives on trains and different places where maybe you think they shouldn't be. We'll get into that. That's a future episode for sure, and we'll get into that then. But for now, just know that it's not a result of PSR. So when railfans say that, they're actually wrong. Now, Wall Street loves PSR. But why? Well, believe it or not, running a railroad is incredibly cash intensive. Just to turn the lights on, so to speak, you need a lot of money. A locomotive sitting around, that's costing money. A freight car sitting in the yard, that's costing money. A yard you don't really need, that costs money. And employees waiting for work that maybe isn't ready yet, that costs money. If you can move the same amount of freight with fewer locomotives and fewer rail cars, fewer facilities, and fewer employees, you've made the railroad considerably more productive. One measurement investors watch closely, as I alluded to before, is operating ratio. And it simply measures how much of the railroad's operating revenue is consumed by operating expenses. It is the cost of doing business. Not to repeat myself, but that is very important here. If a railroad has an operating ratio of, say, 60%, roughly 60 cents of every dollar of operating revenue is going toward operating expenses. The lower you can get that number, generally, the better off the railroad is. PSR helped drive operating ratios down at several major railroads, and investors noticed. PSR helped to make already profitable Class 1 railroads even leaner, and investors were rewarded with improved margins. But there's something important to understand here. PSR isn't a rule book. Different railroads have adopted its different principles to different degrees and implemented them in different ways. Not every railroad is run the same. That's one reason arguments over what is and what isn't actually PSR can get complicated. And it brings us to the people who often have a very different opinion of what it is. The people that actually work on the railroad, and not the guy with the YouTube channel talking about the business of it, and not the railfan, and not the executive sitting in an office or a cubicle somewhere. The people who have a view from the ground. That's the other side of the story, and that's the other side of efficiency. Imagine your local grocery store discovers it can operate fairly normally with 10 employees instead of 15. Well, that's great for the company's expenses. Until the day when 3 people call off. The old system maybe had some excess capacity. The new system doesn't have any at all. And that's one of the fundamental complaints you will hear about PSR. The fat wasn't merely trimmed. Railroaders will tell you that in some cases, management kept trimming well past the fat and into the muscle, and in some cases down to the bone. As railroads implemented PSR, their industry also saw workforce reductions, locomotive reductions, yard consolidations, and increasingly long trains. We talked about longer and longer trains yesterday when we covered DPUs. Those changes became closely associated with PSR, even though they aren't necessarily requirements of Harrison's original operating philosophy. When everything works according to plan, that leaner railroad can be remarkably efficient. It is a well-oiled machine. The problem comes when everything doesn't work completely according to plan. And sometimes things not going according to plan is completely unpredictable. It's not even anyone's fault. Bad weather happens. Locomotives break down. Sometimes crews just aren't available. Customers don't always produce exactly the amount of freight the railroad was expecting. Traffic counts can surge. Derailments, unfortunately, happen. A railroad is an enormous interconnected system, and one disruption can ripple hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. Those effects are felt. Having spare locomotives, extra employees, and additional yard capacity looks inefficient on a spreadsheet when you're sitting in a cubicle or in an office. And they are, until you need them. One of the most visible complaints associated with PSR has been the increasingly long length and weight of freight trains. There's an obvious economic reason for them. Every additional train requires another crew and more locomotives, etc. That costs money. Combine that traffic and all those rail cars that might have moved on 2 trains now move on 1, and potentially you can essentially move the same amount of freight with fewer trains. That's attractive economics. But there is a practical limit to everything. Very long trains can be very difficult to handle. We talked about some of those stresses yesterday when we discussed DPUs. They can lock grade crossings for extended periods of time. Not 20 minutes from my house, Lowellville, Ohio, on the Newcastle subdivision, CSX, for a period because of a project at Baltimore, which is hundreds of miles away, it was seeing increased traffic last summer. And as it approached the Hazleton Yard in Youngstown, which is NS, but CSX crossed through it, and there's a crossover, and sometimes trains have to wait, those trains would back up through Lowellville, Ohio, a 2-mile-long train in a small town, through the middle of the town. That blocked every crossing in town. Can you imagine how miserable that was for those people? It would just be stopped there for like an hour. That may seem funny, and maybe the first time it kind of is, but it's not funny when it happens at 2 in the morning and your house is across the street and you have to listen to the ding, 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 ding for an hour at 2 a.m. Nobody likes that. Imagine you have to go to work and you simply can't cross the tracks. You're stuck. Well, maybe that's funny once. It's not funny the time an ambulance can't cross the tracks. And that happened. These super long trains do not necessarily fit easily into existing sidings and yards. And when something goes wrong with a train that's 2 or 3 miles long, solving that problem isn't simple. For the people sitting in the corporate office, a longer train can represent improved productivity, and oftentimes it is improved productivity. But for the person who actually has to operate that train, it represents something entirely different. And I think that's important. Railroaders are not the only people that complain about PSR. Some railroad customers were not particularly happy either. A railroad can design an incredibly efficient operating plan, but the railroad's customers don't necessarily operate according to that plan. They have their own business to worry about. A grain elevator, a chemical plant, a steel mill, an auto plant. They need cars when they need cars. And critics of PSR have also argued that as railroads optimize their networks around efficiency, some customers lost flexibility and service suffered. That's important to note. A railroad can become more efficient at operating its railroad while simultaneously becoming more convenient for the customers using it. But that didn't always happen here. And complaints from shippers became serious enough to attract the attention of regulators and then Congress. So by this point, PSR wasn't simply an obscure railroading operating philosophy. It had become controversial. In the railroad world, PSR was almost a four-letter word. And there's another complication here. At this point, PSR can mean a lot of different things depending whom you ask and for what railroad we're talking about. Hunter Harrison's original operating philosophy isn't necessarily identical to every decision that has been made in the name of PSR. Cost cutting isn't automatically PSR. Longer trains are not automatically PSR. Laying off employees isn't by itself PSR. But after years of workforce reductions, consolidations, longer trains, increasingly aggressive efficiency targets, PSR became the label that many railroaders attached to the entire process. And frankly, that is completely understandable. If management tells you a new operating philosophy is making your railroad more efficient while your job becomes more difficult, and your coworkers start to disappear and you're being asked to accomplish more with less, you're probably going to have less than warm feelings about the operating philosophy. And that may explain something else. When railroaders complain about PSR, they aren't necessarily criticizing the idea that freight should spend less time sitting around. They may just be criticizing what happened to their railroad in the pursuit of efficiency. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. Bottom line, did or does PSR work? Well, that's where the answer gets complicated, like so many things in life. Financially, it's difficult to argue that PSR was a failure. It helped major freight railroads improve asset utilization, reduce cost, improve operating margins, and on and on and on. There was a legitimate economic idea here. And there were legitimate results. But the railroad doesn't exist solely on an income statement. It has customers, it has employees, it has communities through which its trains operate. And it needs enough resilience to keep functioning when the real world refuses to cooperate with the operating plan. Perhaps the biggest criticism of PSR isn't that efficiency is bad. It's the question of how far you can push efficiency before efficiency itself starts creating new problems. And that's where I especially really hope to hear from the railroaders watching this video. I can read about PSR from investors, from analysts. I can listen to interviews with executives. I can, see what regulators have to say. But you guys have actually lived through the transition. Did PSR make your railroad better? Did it make your job harder? I think I know the answer based on a lot of comments I've already seen, but if you'd be good enough to share some details, I would be very interested to read it. I hope to read your comments below, because I have a feeling many of you are going to have a lot to add to this conversation. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Railroad Economics. My name is Mark Magana. I hope you will like, subscribe, do the things, and watch some more videos. It really helps out the channel. Thank you so very much.